A young man offered his seat to a pregnant woman on a crowded bus. Now grateful, she handed him a note before she left. The note contained something that would profoundly change his life. Now what followed next is astonishing. Luther stepped onto the crowded bus, feeling the weight of another tiring workday. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat and the frustration that everybody crammed together. As he looked around for a place to sit, he saw tired faces everywhere, each one reflecting the same exhaustion that he felt. Carefully making his way through the narrow aisle, Luther spotted a free seat. But just as he was about to sit down, he saw a woman standing nearby. Now, her pale face and her noticeable pregnant body caught his eye. Without thinking twice, he offered her the seat. "Please, you can have his seat," Luther said softly, his voice almost lost in the noise of the bus engine. Dolly looked up in surprise, her eyes showing signs of exhaustion with dark circles around them. As she blinked in disbelief at the unexpected act of kindness. "Are you really sure?" she asked, her voice shaking a little. Luther gave her a tired but warm smile. "Absolutely, you need it more than I do." As Dolly took the seat, a quiet stir spread among the other passengers. Now some nodded in approval while others muttered complaints about the brief pause. Luther paid him no mind, focusing instead on keeping his balance as the bus jerked forward. Throughout the ride, Luther couldn't help but glance at Dolly. She sat quietly with her eyes closed, one hand gently resting on her rounded belly. There was something about her that caught his attention, a touch of grace that didn't quite fit in with the crowded, noisy bus. As the bus approached her stop, Dolly struggled to stand. Luther instinctively reached out to help steady her. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Dolly gave him a grateful smile. Just before she stepped off the bus, she slipped him a piece of paper into his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, before disappearing into the crowd outside. Luther unfolded the paper and saw an address written in elegant handwriting. A frown formed on his face as he recognized the street name. Why would this stranger give him her address? The mystery of it puzzled him, leaving him both curious and uneasy as the bus continued its journey throughout the night. For days, Luther wrestled with the decision of whether to visit the address that Dolly had given him. Now, his curiosity grew stronger, even as his cautious nature urged him to stay away. But eventually, the need to solve the mystery won out, and he found himself standing before a grand wrought iron gate on a quiet, tree-lined street. Luther checked the address again, his eyes widened as he looked at the massive mansion behind the gate. Now, this wasn't just any house. It was a place of obvious wealth and luxury. Now, suddenly, he felt out of place in his worn work clothes, unsure if he belonged in such a setting. Just as Luther was about to turn away, a voice crackled through an intercom. "May I help you?" Luther cleared his throat, feeling a bit nervous. Yes, I'm here to see Dolly. She gave me this address on the bus." There was a brief silence, followed by a buzzing sound as the gate slowly opened. Now Luther walked up the long driveway, his heart racing. Before he could even knock, the front door opened and Dolly stood there. Now she looked different in this setting, still wary, but now more composed, dressed in a flowing maternity gown. "You actually came," she said, her voice carrying a blend of relief and anxiety. "Please come inside." Luther stepped into a beautifully decorated foyer, feeling more out of place with every single step. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he started to say, but Dolly waved off his concerns with a gentle smile. "No, not at all. I'm actually glad you came." Dolly led Luther into a cozy sitting room, motioning for him to sit down. "I realize this might seem a bit strange to you." Luther nodded, curious and waiting for her to explain. Dolly took a deep breath, her hands nervously twisting together in her lap. "I have a proposal for you," she began. "I'm in need of a companion during my pregnancy, somebody to help with everyday tasks, go with me to appointments, and just be there for support." Luther's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "And you want me to do this? But we barely know each other." Dolly gave a small, wry smile. "I know it's unusual, but your kindness on the bus really stood out to me. I need somebody like that in my life right now." She mentioned a payment amount that made Luther's eyes widen in shock. "That would be your monthly compensation." Luther leaned back in his seat, stunned. The amount Dolly had offered was more than he earned in 3 months at his current job. But something didn't quite add up. "Why me?" he asked, still trying to process the situation. "Don't you have friends or family who could help you?" A shadow flickered across Dolly's face. "It's complicated," she said quietly. "I need someone who isn't part of my usual circle, somebody who won't judge me or report back to my family. Luther felt a mix of excitement and unease. The money could solve so many of his family's problems, but he sensed that Dolly wasn't telling him everything. Even so, he found himself nodding. "Okay," he said slowly, "I'll do it, but I need to understand what I'm getting into." Dolly's relief was obvious. "Of course," she replied, "I'll explain everything." As Dolly began to describe the arrangement, Luther couldn't help shake the feeling that his life was about to take a very unexpected turn. Luther's first week working for Dolly flew by in a whirlwind of new experiences. He quickly familiarized himself with the layout of the vast Harrington estate, but what stood out more was the complex relationships within its walls. One evening, while Luther was organizing Dolly's schedule for the next day, he heard raised voices coming from the study. His curiosity piqued, he moved closer to the slightly open door. "This is my life, Dad." Dolly's voice was thick with emotion. "You can't keep controlling everything I do." A deep, commanding voice responded, "I'm trying to protect you, Dolly. You don't understand the repercussions of your choices." Luther recognized the voice. It was William Harrington, Dolly's father, a powerful real estate mogul known for his cutthroat business methods. "I'm not a child anymore," Dolly shot back. "I'm capable of making my own decisions, including how I manage this pregnancy." William's voice dropped to a menacing tone. "You've already made enough bad choices. That's why we're in this situation. I won't allow you to further damage our family's reputation." Hearing footsteps headed his way, Luther quickly retreated to where he'd been working. Seconds later, William Harrington stormed out of the study, his face tight with barely suppressed anger. He cast Luther a suspicious look before disappearing down the hallway. After a brief pause, Luther approached the study and gently knocked on the door. "Dolly, are you okay?" He found her sitting behind a large oak desk, her face buried in her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but dry. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," she said, trying to muster up a weak smile. Luther stepped closer, concern clear on his face. "You want to talk about it?" Dolly sighed and ran her hand through her hair. "My father, he always thinks he knows what's best for everyone. He just can't accept that I want to live my life differently than what he planned." "That sounds really difficult," Luther said, sitting on the edge of a nearby chair. "Has it always been this way?" Dolly nodded. "Pretty much, but it's gotten worse since..." She paused, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. Luther felt a strong sense of protectiveness. "You know, you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here to help, remember?" For a brief moment, Dolly's usual defenses seemed to fade. She looked at Luther with a mix of gratitude and something else that he couldn't quite place. "Thank you, Luther. You have no idea how much that means to me." As they sat together in the dimming light of the study, Luther sensed a change in their relationship. This was no longer just a job. He was starting to care deeply about Dolly's well-being and her fight for independence. From the way she looked at him, it seemed like she felt the same. The moment was interrupted by the distant slam of a door. Dolly flinched, then quickly composed herself. "We should probably review tomorrow's schedule," she said, her voice returning to its usual business-like tone. Luther nodded, but as they went over the plans for the next day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something far more complex than he had anticipated. The real question was whether he was prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. As the weeks went by, Luther settled into his role as Dolly's companion and assistant. His duties ranged from helping with household tasks to joining her on shopping trips for baby supplies. But the medical appointments turned out to be the most eye-opening and sometimes unsettling part of the job. One crisp autumn morning, Luther drove Dolly to her obstetrician's office for a routine checkup. As they waited, he noticed how tense she seemed, her fingers tapping nervously on her knee. "Is everything okay?" Luther asked quietly. Dolly forced a smile. "Just the usual pre-appointment nerves," she said. But Luther could tell that there was more to it. Their conversation was interrupted when a nurse called Dolly's name. Now Luther stood up to go with her as he usually did, but Dolly hesitated. "Maybe you should wait here this time," she said, her voice carrying an unusual tone. Before Luther could reply, a man's voice broke through the soft buzz of the waiting room. "Dolly, what a surprise to see you here." Luther turned to see a tall man in a sharp suit walking towards him. His smile was broad but seemed insincere. Dolly's face went noticeably pale. "Hello, James," Dolly said stiffly. "I didn't expect to see you here." James glanced at Luther with a hint of curiosity. And who's this? Got a new boyfriend already? Luther felt a surge of anger at the man's tone, but kept his expression neutral. I'm Luther, Dolly's assistant, he said calmly. Ah, I see, James replied, his smile taking on a predatory edge. How convenient. Dolly quickly grabbed Luther's arm, her grip tight and painful. We need to leave, now. As they rushed towards the examination room, Luther heard James call out, We should catch up soon, Dolly. We have a lot to talk about. Once they were inside the privacy of the exam room, Dolly slumped against the wall, breathing quickly and shallowly. Luther knelt beside her, his face showing concern. Who was that guy? He asked gently. Dolly closed her eyes to steady herself before answering. James, my ex and the father of my baby. Luther was taken aback. I thought you said the father wasn't involved. He isn't supposed to be, Dolly said with bitterness. We broke up months ago. He's not a good person. Seeing him here, it can't be a coincidence. Luther's mind raced as he tried to understand this new information. Do you think he's followed you? Dolly nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Probably. He's always been controlling. When I left him, he threatened to make my life a nightmare if I didn't come back. Luther felt a strong urge to protect her. We should report him to the police. Dolly shook her head. No, we can't. It's too complicated. There are things you don't know, things that could hurt my family if they were revealed. Luther wanted to ask more questions, but at that moment the doctor entered the room. As the examination went on, Luther couldn't shake the sense that things were getting more dangerous. James' thinly veiled threats, Dolly's fear, and the family secrets that she hinted at all suggested that trouble was on the way. As they left the clinic, Luther noticed a sleek black car parked across the street. He wasn't sure, but he thought he saw James sitting behind the wheel watching him. We'll face this together, Luther said quietly as he opened the car door for Dolly. No matter what happens, you're not alone. Dolly looked at him, her eyes showing a mix of gratitude and concern. I hope you're ready for this, Luther, because I have a feeling things are going to get a lot more complicated. As they drove away, Luther couldn't stop wondering what he'd gotten himself into. But as he glanced at Dolly, her hand protectively resting on her belly, he realized he couldn't walk away now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was determined to face them with her. As the crisp autumn days gave way to the chill of early winter, Luther and Dolly's relationship grew beyond just employer and employee. They started spending more time together, even outside of Dolly's appointments and tasks. One evening, while they were relaxed in the mansion's cozy library with a fire crackling in the hearth, Luther began to talk about his life before he met Dolly. I've always dreamed of owning my own business, he said, staring into the flames. A small carpentry shop, maybe. I'd love to make things in my hands. But with helping my parents and saving for my sister's college, it always feels out of reach. Dolly listened closely, her eyes showing understanding. That's a wonderful dream, Luther. I can see the passion in your eyes when you talk about it. Luther shrugged, feeling a bit embarrassed by her focus. And what about you? What dreams did you have before everything changed? Dolly's hand instinctively moved to her growing belly. I wanted to be a writer, she said quietly. Not the kind of romance novels my father dismisses, but real stories that matter. What stopped you? Luther asked, genuinely interested. Dolly's smile turned bitter. My father. He has very specific ideas about what a Harrington should and shouldn't do, and writing doesn't fit into his vision for the family legacy. Luther frowned. But it's your life. Surely he can't control everything you do. You'd be surprised, Dolly murmured. After a moment's silence, she added, sometimes I think this baby might be my chance to break free and create a life that's truly my own. Luther felt a surge of protectiveness. You can still pursue your dreams, it's not too late. Dolly's eyes met his, a glimmer of hope appearing in them. Maybe you're right. Maybe we both can. The moment was broken by the sound of the front door slamming. Dolly immediately tensed, her earlier openness replaced by a look of anxiety. That'll be my father, she said, her voice tight. We should probably, but before they could react, William Harrington's imposing figure filled the doorway. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him. Dolly, I need to speak with you. Alone, William said, his gaze dismissively sweeping over Luther. You can leave now. We won't need you for the rest of the evening. Luther felt a flash of anger at the man's tone, but kept quiet for Dolly's sake. As he stood up to leave, Dolly reached out and briefly squeezed his hand. The touch sent a jolt through him, a silent gesture of gratitude and understanding. As Luther walked to his room in the staff quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had changed between him and Dolly. Their shared dreams and the quiet intimacy of their moment hinted at a connection deeper than he had expected. But this connection came with a lot of complications. William Harrington's clear disdain, the looming threat of James, and the tangled web of family secrets that Dolly was all caught up in. All these factors combined to create a sense of looming crisis. Luther tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake off his swirling thoughts. Despite his efforts to keep things professional, he found himself falling for Dolly. He wondered if he was ready to face the upheaval that loving her would bring. More importantly, he questioned whether he was strong enough to stand by her side when that storm hit. As sleep finally took over, his last thoughts were Dolly's smile and the future that they'd begun to imagine together. He was starting to believe that whatever challenges lay ahead would be worth facing as long as they faced them together. The atmosphere in the Harrington house had been growing tense for weeks, like a pressure cooker about to burst. Luther could feel it in the charged air. He could see it in the lines around Dolly's eyes, and he could hear it in the frequent arguments behind closed doors. But nothing prepared him for the night when everything finally reached its breaking point. The stillness of the night was shattered by the sound of glass breaking and loud shouting. Luther jolted awake, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly got out of bed and rushed towards the main house. As he neared, he could hear Dolly's voice rising in panic, mixed with the angry shouts of a man that he didn't recognize. Luther flung open the front door to a scene of chaos in the grand foyer. Dolly was pressed against the wall, her face pale with fear. James stood in front of her, his face twisted in rage. His once charming features were now filled with fury. "You think you can just cut me out?" James yelled, his arms flailing. "After everything I've done for your family, I'll ruin you all." Nearby, William Harrington's face was a mask of cold anger. "You need to leave immediately," he said in a dangerously calm tone, "or I'll call the authorities." A cold, derisive laugh echoed throughout the foyer. "Oh, William," James sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "You won't dare do that. Unless, of course, you want your dirty little secrets plastered all over the front page of every newspaper in the country." Luther's instinct surged, and he quickly stepped between James and Dolly, shielding her from the man's anger. "That's enough," Luther said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You need to leave. Now." James shot a withering glare, his eyes narrowing as he looked him over. "And who the hell are you? Just a hired help? Stay out of this, boy. You got no idea what you're messing with." Luther didn't even flinch. "I know enough to see that you're not wanted here and that you're frightening Dolly. That's all I need to know." James' sly grin stretched wider, an unsettling contrast to the tension in the air. Luther braced himself, ready for James to lash out. But instead, the man took a step back, raising his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "All right," James said smoothly, "I'll leave. But don't think that this is the end, Dolly. We're far from finished." His gaze shifted to William and his voice dropped to a menacing growl. "And as for you, old man, your days are numbered. You better watch yourself." James' footsteps echoed through the hallway as he stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down Luther's spine. He immediately turned to Dolly, who was visibly shaken, her arms wrapped protectively around her growing belly. "Are you all right?" Luther asked gently, his voice full of concern. He wanted nothing more than to comfort her, but he held back, sensing the fragility of the moment. Before Dolly could answer, William's icy voice sliced through the silence, brimming with fury. "You!" he spat, his finger stabbing the air in Luther's direction. "I want you out of here by morning. You're fired." Dolly's eyes widened in disbelief. "Dad, no, you can't do that. Luther was just trying to protect me." The tension hung thick in the air as William glared at Luther, his face set in stone. "This is a private family matter, Dolly," he said coldly. "We don't need strangers meddling in our business." Luther's patience snapped, his voice steady but firm. "Sir, I understand your concern, but I'm not going anywhere unless Dolly tells me to." For a moment, the silence was suffocating, with all three locked in an unspoken battle of wills. Then something shifted in Dolly. She lifted her head, determination hardening her features. "Luther stays," she declared, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I need him here, Dad. If you can't accept that, then maybe I should be the one to leave." William's face flushed with anger, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the right words. But before he could unleash his response, Dolly turned abruptly, rushing up the stairs with Luther following closely behind. Once they reached the sanctuary of her room, the weight of the confrontation finally hit Dolly. She collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling with the effort of holding back tears. Without hesitation, Luther knelt in front of her, gently taking her hands in his. As the tension in the room settled into an uneasy calm, Luther knelt beside Dolly, his voice gentle but resolute. "We'll get through this," he reassured her, his tone filled with quiet determination. "We'll face whatever comes, and we'll do it together." Dolly looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but there was something else in her gaze, an unspoken gratitude, a warmth that sent a jolt through Luther's heart. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've been my rock through all of this." As he held her hands, offering whatever comfort he could in that moment, Luther felt a profound shift. The boundaries between them, once so clear, had become a tangled web of emotions and unspoken feelings. The situation with James was far from over, and William's looming disapproval was a constant shadow over their heads. Yet, despite the growing complications and the looming threats, Luther felt a deep sense of resolve. No matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he knew he was ready to face it all, as long as Dolly was by his side. The challenges were daunting, but the bond they shared made it worth every risk. Together they would stand against whatever storms was coming. As the days passed after the clash with James, Luther couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside of him. The Harrington mansion, once lively, now felt heavy with tension. Dolly had pulled away, spending most of her time alone in her room, while William's constant disapproving looks reminded Luther just how shaky his position had become. Sensing there was more to the situation than met the eye, Luther decided to dig deeper. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Luther crept into the study to research James online. What he discovered made his stomach drop. James had a string of minor offenses, things like being drunk in public and a few assault charges that seemed to disappear without explanation. But what really caught Luther's attention was James' involvement in real estate. Now, several of his projects had been accused of corruption and fraud, though nothing had ever been stuck. The more Luther read, the clearer it became that James wasn't just a threat. He was a dangerous man with a history of getting away with things. Now, Luther knew he had to stay alert. This wasn't just about protecting Dolly anymore. It was about surviving whatever storm James might bring their way. Luther's investigation took him on a journey through a web of connections between James and the Harrington family. He unearthed old newspaper articles that listed William and James as business partners, along with photographs of them together at charity events and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Clearly, their ties ran much deeper than just James being Dolly's former boyfriend. As Luther continued his research, he stumbled upon traces of a large development project that had collapsed several years prior. The specifics was unclear, but there was rumors of corruption, environmental misconduct, and the loss of millions of dollars. Now, both the Harrington family and James' company were linked to this disastrous project. Trying to make sense of it all, Luther's thoughts swirled. Could this be the cause of the friction between James and the Harringtons? Was James threatening to reveal these hidden truths? Eager to uncover the full story, Luther decided to take a bold step. He contacted an old friend, a paralegal, and asked for any information they could dig up on the failed project and the companies involved. Several days later, Luther received a secure email packed with a mountain of documents. As he carefully examined each one, a sinking feeling settled into his chest. The files revealed a massive web of corruption implicating not only James but also William Harrington. Bribery, fake environmental assessments, and shell companies hiding enormous sums of money. Now, it was all laid out clearly in the documents. Luther leaned back, overwhelmed by what he'd uncovered. The reason for William's desperation to silence James became clear, as did Dolly's struggle between family loyalty and her own desire for freedom. The Harrington dynasty was built on lies and illegal activities, and James held the key to his downfall. And yet, this revelation came with a heavy weight. Luther realized that he couldn't withhold this information from Dolly, but sharing it would forever alter their relationship and might even endanger them both. James had already shown that he would use threats and intimidation. If he found out that Luther knew the truth, there was no telling what lengths he might go to in order to silence him. As the first light of dawn filtered through the study windows, Luther made up his mind. He would tell Dolly everything he'd uncovered. She needed to know the truth about her family and the father of her child. It was the only way that she could make decisions about her and her baby's future with full knowledge. Luther braced himself for the difficult conversation ahead. He knew it would be one of the hardest he'd ever had. But when he thought of Dolly, her resilience, her kindness, the bond that they developed, he was certain that it was the right choice to make. Whatever consequences would follow from revealing the truth, they would face them together. Taking a deep breath, Luther gathered the documents and made his way to Dolly's room, prepared to expose the dark secrets that had been hidden within the walls of the Harrington mansion for far too long. His hand hesitated over Dolly's door, the weight of the documents suddenly feeling heavier. Now, just as he was about to knock, a noise from downstairs drew his attention. He quickly moved to investigate, only to find the house in chaos. The foyer echoed with William Harrington's thunderous voice as he demanded, "What do you mean she's gone?" His face was a mix of fury and something Luther recognized as fear. Marcus, the head of security, a usually unflappable man, stood before him, his calm demeanor slightly cracked. "Sir, Miss Dolly's room is empty, her car is missing, and so is her passport. We're reviewing the security footage, but it seems like she left early this morning." Luther's heart sank. Dolly had left without telling him a thing. No, it didn't add up. William's gaze locked onto Luther, his eyes filled with suspicion. "You," he snarled, snapping toward Luther. "Did you know about this? Did you help her escape?" Luther quickly raised his hand in defense, shaking his head. "No, sir, I had no idea. I was just coming to speak with her myself." Luther's heart pounded as he observed William, who appeared on the verge of losing control. But just when it seemed like he might act on his anger, William held back. "Marcus," he ordered sharply, "do whatever it takes. I want my daughter found now, no exceptions." With that command, the security team scattered, leaving Luther standing still, his thoughts spiraling. Why would Dolly leave so abruptly, and where could she have gone? The next several hours blurred into a flurry of activity. Luther threw himself into the search, reaching out to every contact he could think of, and checking all the familiar places Dolly might seek refuge in the city. But as hours passed with no sign of her, an uneasy feeling began to creep into his mind. By the time Luther dragged himself back to his room, it was well after midnight. Exhausted and filled with dread, he collapsed onto his bed. And just as he closed his eyes, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The message on Luther's phone was brief but unmistakable. "Luther, it's me. I'm safe. Can't explain more now. Be careful. Trust no one." A sense of relief washed over him, but it was quickly overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. The message was so vague, yet the cautionary tone hinted at something far darker than a mere escape from her controlling father. His thoughts drifted back to the incriminating documents that he'd stumbled upon. Could Dolly be aware of the corruption? Was she fleeing from something more dangerous than just family pressure? As all these thoughts churned in his mind, another text appeared. 44 Blackbird Lane. Midnight tomorrow. Come along. Luther's heart started to race. He knew the location well, an old abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. It was an odd and unsettling place to arrange a meeting, and the directive to come alone only heightened his anxiety. And yet, he knew he couldn't back down. Dolly was in trouble, and no matter the danger, he had to be there for her. Throughout the day, Luther remained on high alert, carefully avoiding William's suspicious looks and dodging questions from the security team. As evening approached, he made his escape from the mansion under the guise of a routine excuse, his heart racing with both excitement and anxiety. The warehouse stood before him, a menacing shadow against the darkening sky. Despite the creeping sense of danger, he thought of Dolly possibly being in peril, and that drove him forward. He managed to open the old rusty door, wincing at the loud creak that shattered the silence of the abandoned space. Suddenly, a blinding beam of light cut through the gloom, causing him to flinch. As his eyes adjusted, his breath caught in his throat. There, tied to a chair in the center of the room, was Dolly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and her cheeks streaking with tears. "Dolly," Luther said urgently, "what's happening?" She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes and whispered, "You shouldn't have come. It's a trap." Before Luther could respond, he felt the cold touch of metal against his head. A familiar voice came from behind him, sending a shiver down his spine. "Ah, Luther," James said smoothly. "Looks like our little family gathering is all set." Luther's mind raced and adrenaline surged through him as he took in the scene. James stood behind him with a gun, posing a constant threat, while Dolly sat tied to a chair, her face showing both fear and desperation. "James, let her go," Luther demanded, trying to sound calm. "This is between us." James laughed harshly, his voice echoing in the warehouse. "It's far more complicated than that, Luther. Dolly knows too much, and I have a feeling you do too." Luther's mind raced as he recalled the documents he'd found. This was his moment to get the full story. "You're talking about the development project, the bribes, the cover-ups, right?" He could sense James tensing behind him. Dolly looked at him, clearly shocked. "So you're aware of it," James sneered. "That makes things a bit more complicated, doesn't it?" Taking a steadying breath, Luther decided to be straightforward. "I know about William's role too, how you two defrauded investors and evaded regulations. What I don't get is why you're doing this now. Why target Dolly?" James moved into view, keeping the gun aimed at Luther but letting him see his face. The usual charm was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. James smirked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Well, my naive friend, Dolly has uncovered some damning evidence. It could bring down not just her father, but many powerful people in the city. She was planning to expose it. Weren't you, darling?" Dolly raised her head with determination. "Somebody has to stop this corruption. I couldn't just watch my father ruin lives for money." Luther felt a mix of respect and worry for her bravery. James continued with a sneer in his voice. "But it's not just her father at risk. If Dolly talks, I'm finished too, and I'm not about to let that happen." "What's your plan then?" Luther asked, buying time as he looked around the warehouse for any escape options. "You can't keep us here forever." James flashed a chilling smile, sending a shiver down Luther's spine. "I don't intend to keep you here," James said calmly. "I've set up a little accident, a warehouse fire that will claim the lives of a pregnant woman and her loyal assistant. Tragic, isn't it?" Dolly gasped, her hand instinctively moving to shield her stomach. Luther's anger flared with a fierce protectiveness. "You won't get away with this," he said through clenched teeth. James simply shrugged. "Oh, but I already have. The accelerant is all set. One spark and this place will go up in flames. Meanwhile, I'll be long gone with a perfect alibi." As James continued his sinister speech, Luther's mind raced with urgency. He knew he had to act quickly. In a sudden move, he lunged at James, tackling him to the floor. The gun fired, the bullet missing its mark as the two men struggled on the cold concrete. "Luther!" Dolly cried out, her voice filled with panic as she fought against her restraints. Luther managed to knock the gun away from James' grip, watching it slide across the floor. But James, driven by desperation, landed a powerful punch to Luther's jaw, leaving him dazed. As Luther tried to clear his head, he saw James scrambling for the gun. Without hesitation, Luther decided to leave James behind. He rushed to Dolly, working quickly to free her. "We need to get out of here," Luther said breathlessly, finally untying her. They raced towards the exit, hearing James' angry shouts behind them. Just as they reached the door, flames erupted behind them. James had set the fire. Luther and Dolly burst into the cool night air, gasping for breath and coughing from the smoke. Behind them, the warehouse was quickly consumed by flames. Dolly managed to stay between coughs. "Izzy!" A figure stumbled out of the blaze, cloak smoking. James, his face twisted in anger and agony, staggered toward him. "This isn't over," he spat before collapsing to the ground. As the distant sound of sirens grew louder, Luther held Dolly tightly, both of them shaking from the trauma that they'd endured. He knew their troubles weren't over. William Harrington was still out there, and the corruption they had uncovered was extensive. But looking at Dolly, seeing her determination despite everything she faced, Luther felt a spark of hope. Together, they had a chance to reveal the truth and to create a better future for themselves and for their city. When the first responders arrived, Luther and Dolly braced themselves for what was to come. The fight for justice had only just begun, but they was prepared to face it together. The scene after the warehouse fire was chaotic. Ambulances and police cars filled the area as Luther and Dolly were bombarded with questions and accusations. James, barely conscious, was taken to the hospital under police guard. Although the authorities were initially doubtful of Luther and Dolly's story, they became more interested as they started to piece together the evidence. In the midst of the turmoil, William Harrington arrived, his face a mixture of rage and worry. "Dolly," he yelled, pushing through the police barrier. "What have you done?" Luther moved to shield Dolly, but she calmly pushed him aside. "No, Dad," Dolly said, her voice firm despite her visible fatigue. "The real question is, What have you done? William's face went pale as he understood the weight of her words. Before he could respond, a detective approached and asked them all to come to the station for questioning. The next few hours were a blur of interviews and new information. Luther and Dolly shared their accounts, supported by the evidence that Luther had collected. As the night had progressed, it became clear that the corruption they had uncovered was even deeper than they had initially realized. In an unexpected moment of vulnerability, William Harrington, confronted with overwhelming evidence, broke down. He admitted the full extent of his involvement and his reasons. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, his voice breaking. "I started with small bribes to speed up permits. But James? He saw a chance. He blackmailed me and threatened to reveal everything unless I helped him with his schemes." Dolly, who'd been silent up to this point, finally spoke. "Why didn't you come clean, Dad? Why risk everything?" William looked at his daughter with regret in his eyes. "I thought I was protecting our family and our legacy. I was wrong." With the truth revealed, things started to change. Realizing how much danger he'd put Dolly in, William began to cooperate fully with the authorities. His confession, along with the evidence Luther and Dolly had collected, was enough to bring down not only James, but also several other corrupt officials and business people. In the days that followed, Luther and Dolly were thrust into the spotlight as the media frenzy took over. The city was captivated by the story of corruption, attempted murder, and their brave actions to expose the truth. Throughout this intense period, they leaned on each other, facing press conferences and legal challenges side by side. To make amends for the harm caused by the corrupt schemes, William Harrington sought to show remorse. He used his resources to set up a fund for those affected by the fraudulent development projects and work with environmental groups to repair the damage done. As things began to calm down, Luther and Dolly found a rare moment of peace. They stood together on the balcony in Dolly's apartment, gazing out at the city that they'd helped transform. "What happens now?" Luther asked, taking Dolly's hand. She looked at him, a small smile on her face. "We rebuild," she said softly. "We fix things and we do it together." Luther nodded, feeling a wave of emotion. "Together," he agreed. As they stood there, the first light of dawn spread across the sky. They felt a sense of hope and possibility. The path ahead would be tough, with legal battles, family issues, and a corrupt system to tackle. But they had each other and the truth on their side. The city was starting a new day, free from the corruption that had long overshadowed it. Looking at Dolly, her face illuminated by the morning light, Luther knew their journey was just beginning. Whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together, with courage and determination. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was filled with hope. As they shared a gentle kiss in the dawn's glow, Luther and Dolly silently promised to stand by each other, fight for justice, and work towards a better world that they were committed to creating.